The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 10. Back to Berlin and Beyond. Berlin. I knew the city from a distance already, before its terrible destruction became wholly evident. Was I really going home at last? It must be so. A few haggard faces in the truck with me lit up with the happy assurance that the nightmare was about to end. For others whose homes were back in the direction from which we'd come, Berlin meant only that we were nearer the eastern borders, nearer Russia, nearer the dread camps. I wondered what my father would say when he saw me. I had been long in fulfilling my promise to return, but now he must have had word of my mother. Here I could begin inquiries about my husband. Here I would, with God's help, pick up the broken pieces of my life again. As we came closer to Berlin, I realized that it would take a miracle to fulfill those fond hopes. I saw that the last days of the war must have loosed a holocaust upon my beloved city. Berliners had always taken such pride in their substantial houses, their well-kept gardens, their spotless streets. Now I saw the blankets replacing the blown-off wall behind which a family, fortunate enough to have 3 walls still standing, lived. Elsewhere, a bit of corrugated tin and some packing boxes served as home. Sick with fear, I clung to my father's serene promise, "This house shall be preserved." We drove down Friedrichstrasse, beautiful Friedrichstrasse. Who would know it now? The street signs were all down, but I recognized it by one of the entrances to the city's fine subway system. Eagerly I looked as we approached. I'd so often ridden the underground, in fact used to come up this very exit to visit my friend Anna. I couldn't believe my eyes. Lapping the steps was a fetid body of garbage-laden water. In those subways, people had sought shelter from the bombs. They had also probably served as a last hiding place for Berlin's defenders. The evidence before me now was that whatever human beings had been down there had been driven out deliberately, like rats, by the rising water. Fearful that even now I might see a body floating amidst the debris, I turned away. If we would just continue straight on, we'd come to Hallisches Tor. Only 1 block beyond would be Blücherstrasse. Oh, thank you, God, I breathed. Now I'll know that my parents' house still stands. I willed the truck to continue that 1 more block, as with eyes closed, my lips formed the word Danke, Danke, over and over. Then I felt the truck make a left turn. My eyes flew open, unbelieving. At one moment I was thanking him for what I thought was indeed a small favor, and the next we were heading in another direction. If ever I'd felt let down. I was so preoccupied with my disappointment that I hardly noticed the sharp shock of the collision. We 50 prisoners and guards tumbled over each other, then scrambled to our feet again. Still feeling cheated, I blurted out to the guard, who was writing himself beside me, "My father lives just on the next street. If we could only have driven by." He saw what I hadn't, that we had collided with a small 3-wheeler postal truck. It wasn't serious, but the 2 drivers were involved in a hot dispute. Quickly, a piece of paper and a pencil were thrust toward me. "Hurry, write a note. I'll give it to the man to deliver." Without wasting a moment to consider this amazing coincidence, I scribbled a line. "I'll be back. I'm well. Maria." I folded it, wrote my father's name and address on the front, and shoved it back into the guard's hand. I watched as he jumped out and gave it to the elderly postal clerk, pointing to the address and obviously trying to get the idea across that he was to be quick about it. Our own driver was so busy yelling and waving his arms that he noticed nothing. The storm of words was soon over, the damage negligible, and we moved on. As we traversed the city and continued on through its eastern suburbs, it became obvious that there was no intention of leaving me here. My fervent plea that I might at least see my father's house hadn't been granted, but I had been given something better, the chance to let him know that I was alive. I had to wait 9 long years to learn the fate of this strangely posted letter. My father also had to wait to receive my note, but not as long as I to learn news of him. The paper had been delivered, as ordered, to the apartment building, but to a neighbor instead of to my father, as he had been ill with typhoid and had gone to stay with a friend for some months. As soon as he was well enough, he'd gone to Dritz to inquire after me. Here one of the shopkeepers was able to tell him that the rest of the family had gone to Stuttgart, but that I wasn't with them, as he himself knew by now. It was assumed that I'd been taken by the Russians into the nearby forest and shot, as others had been. My poor father had searched the woods for some evidence that I'd been there, either dead or alive, but finding nothing, he'd returned sadly to Berlin to take up life again. It was when he recounted to his neighbor his efforts to locate me that she remembered the note and gave it to him. Its message was short, but at least he knew that on June 2nd, 1945, I had been alive and in Berlin, and he was comforted. The collision at Hollisches Tor and the angry dispute that followed hadn't restored me to home or freedom, but it did give me the little glimpse into God's ways that I needed just at that time. So the incident brought comfort to me as well. I could look at the passing streets and buildings with a certain acceptance now, knowing that God had my life under his control, even though I couldn't understand the intricacies of his ways. There were so many memories connected with this city. After Urbach, this was my real home. From that wonderful little kitchen where we had first been reunited as a family in 1922, we'd moved to something vastly more palatial, a tailor's shop. 2 whole rooms it had, plus a kitchen. The former shop became a parlor under my mother's skillful management. The other room was a bristle with bedposts over which one hopped to reach the right bed. It was while here that I at last received my much-delayed education, all 6 weeks of it. Soon after Easter, Alice and I excitedly walked to school together for the first time. She spoke only Russian and was put in the 1st grade. As for myself, I could read and write German, but of history or economics or literature I knew nothing. No matter, I'd make it up, I had promised myself. That summer, however, I turned 14 and couldn't be accepted back for the fall term. Of course, there was no money to continue at a private institution, but my insatiable desire to learn led me to take various courses in evening schools during the years to come, as well as to devour every book that came within reach. Yes, I'd even been able to quote German poetry for my kind Russian interrogator so many years later. With the job my father got in the Ministry of Foreign Trade, he managed to save enough by 1926 to buy a small country farm just outside Berlin. I was working and going to night school, but with my family, I'd go out for holidays and weekends to tend the gardens. Then, in 1927, when my father and I both lost our jobs, we moved out to stay. I took one important memory to our country home with me. It was of a tall, athletic young fellow, 7 exciting years older than I, whom I'd met on the tennis courts just across from our Berlin apartment. When 7 or 8 sweaty and thirsty young bicycling enthusiasts began dropping by the farm on weekends for a drink and a rest on the grass, my father welcomed them warmly and always insisted on giving them something more than the water they politely asked for. Fred was one of the young men. "Write to me, Maria," he'd said one day. "It would be great to hear from you. I can't come out when it's snowing, you know." He smiled, and my heart did strange acrobatics. Writing was out of the question, though, and I told him so. I was only 20. It was unthinkable. "No problem. Look, I'll send you a letter to the post office. You just go there and ask for it. Then it won't cause any scenes at home. Agreed?" Another smile and the same reaction under my chemise. My acquiescence must have shown. With a carefree laugh, he hopped on his bike and waved goodbye. Soon there were 8 gleaming pairs of wheels flashing down the road toward the city, but my eyes followed the bright blue bicycle and its waving rider until it disappeared. We'd agreed that he'd write to Liliane. It seemed deliciously intriguing to ask at our little post office if there were any letters for this romantic creature. There were letters, lots of them, and I wrote just as enthusiastically. When I moved back to Berlin, things progressed even more swiftly. It was, in fact, my parents who suggested that I quit the daily bicycle train tram routine that brought me home so late at night, to take instead a small furnished room with an acquaintance near the shirt factory where I worked. Now, instead of writing letters, Fred and I saw each other. There were sports events and operas and the theater, all heady fare for a girl raised in a strict missionary's family. When Fred began talking of being in love, I got more than a little uncomfortable. Was he a Christian? He said so, but not exactly like you believe. I was afraid to press him too far, possibly because I didn't want to learn anything that would put an end to the good times. It seemed sufficient to me at the moment that he went along to the Baptist congregation where I attended. Things progressed, as I should have known they would. There was a proposal. I realized I loved him. Father must be told, in that order. My mind refused to face this latter necessity. Always when Fred asked me when he would be able to meet my parents, I put him off. I was still waiting at every church service for some sign of response, some assurance that what he said was really true. But always when I looked up into the pleasant, bland face beside me in the church pew, I read nothing. At last I could put him off no longer. Ruth was having a birthday, and there'd be a big crowd at the farm. No chance for my father to corner Fred and get into a discussion. I invited him, and he accepted. That weekend was incredibly long. I'd gone out to the farm on Saturday and gotten the courage to tell my mother that someone wished to come and meet her and father. "Who is it, Maria?" she asked. A young man." "Oh," the short word signaled wary concern. "He's just a young man who comes with me to church," I added brightly. "Oh," this time there was an unmistakable note of relief. "Go tell your father. He's in the study." I was being pushed toward the door. "Tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow," I said, holding back. Our household was like most others on a Sunday morning, with everyone scrambling to eat breakfast, get dressed, tidy up. Of course, we must also be ready for the big crowd at noon on this special day. Before I knew it, I was in church, and my father still didn't know about Fred. As the time for his arrival approached, I grabbed my father in sheer desperation. "There's this man. He goes to our church, and he's coming here. He wants to meet you." It was out at last. I even added something about him wanting to marry me. "Is there a rush on it, Maria? Let's meet him before we talk of marrying." "Oh, no, there's no rush," I replied eagerly. "Of course not." 6 weeks later, we were engaged, and in December of 1930, we were married. This, then, was the city to which I had come as a teenager to begin life anew, and it was the city where I had begun my married life. The memories weren't all happy, to be sure, far from it, but it had been home nevertheless. There was the little house we'd built. My reveries were cut short when our truck entered a small village about 40 kilometers from Berlin. As far as the eye could see, there were people, thousands of them, moving, ever moving, in huge circles, machine guns within the circles, machine guns at their periphery. The truck inched toward the wire enclosure which surrounded this mass of humanity, and with sinking heart I realized that I was destined to join it. Soon I, too, was making those endless, meaningless circuits. Others must have been here for hours already, and as the sun blazed down from the sky, the heat and thirst became unbearable. Toilet facilities were non-existent. When first one, then another demanded more humane treatment, the answer was quickly given with a lash or rifle. Those who had been more recently captured and were therefore stronger continued to cry out against this treatment, but always with the same result. During that long afternoon of forced marching without rest or water, many fell, some to die quickly, others to linger for long, agonizing hours before death released them from their suffering. At last, when all were so exhausted that any complaint or resistance or thought of escape had been stifled, we were led into the houses within the enclosure. From these buildings, all furniture had been removed and the walls lined with 3-decker wooden shelves. With a rush, the designated number of prisoners pressed through the doors to reach the bare planks that were their only hope of rest that night. Never had any of us jumped onto downy mattresses at home more eagerly than we dove for those hard shelves. In an instant, the air was filled with shrieks and the sound of splintering wood. From the top shelf, a heavy-set woman had fallen through to the second tier, and from there had come down with crushing weight on the occupant of the bottom shelf. No sooner had the two injured ones been extricated than another shelf broke, accompanied by the same unnerving outcry. Now all were afraid to use the upper tiers, and so we tried to rearrange ourselves for the night. The moaning of the three injured women worked on our already overwrought nerves, and this combined with our airless rooms and unrelieved thirst to make sleep impossible that night. "Großmutter, did you sleep well?" I asked next morning when Grandma Fuchs stirred and opened her rheumy eyes. She had always looked so surprised when she first woke up, then seemed to take in her strange surroundings with a placid air of acceptance. "Ja, ja, wann essen wir Frühstück?" To sleep and to eat, these were the important things for her. She'd had the former, and now expectantly awaited her breakfast. That it was so often not forthcoming, she seemed to forget from day to day. Sometimes I envied her. While several prisoners from each house were summoned to bring back our ration of bread and water, the rest of us were herded out to the latrines. To this day, I never see a gleaming tile and chrome bathroom without wanting to touch its clean and caressing surfaces. There we had to squat on a board running the length of a 6-foot deep trench. How I learned to fear those pits, the sagging, slippery boards, the foul odor, and worst of all, the presence of the guards, under whose scrutiny we must relieve ourselves. Those open trenches and the lack of sanitary facilities produced the expected result, and typhoid was soon taking its toll among us. The distribution of food became a daily event of the most exacting nature. When the ration of bread was brought to our building, we each took our turn in dividing the loaves and passing the chunks around. It was difficult to break the heavy discs, and we tried hard to be fair, realizing that tomorrow other hands would divide our own small ration. We even developed differing philosophies toward its consumption. Some said it was better to appease the hunger pangs all at once. Others preferred to make their precious bit last throughout the day, and they nibbled it crumb by crumb. The latter method had its drawbacks, however. During the course of the day, crumbs could be lost, or the whole piece stolen. Soon all were devouring theirs at once. We stayed a week at this collection center, and daily our milling circles became larger. When we set off again one morning, none of us were sorry, though we had no idea where our day's march might lead us. Anything seemed better than the sagging shelves and the loathsome trenches and the endless tramping. High electric barbed wire and watchtowers surrounded the farming village of Wiesau, to which we were brought that night. It was obviously an installation newly emptied of its citizens and ready for our arrival, and since I no longer daily looked for release, I tried to cheer myself with the hope of at least better treatment. With relief, we women crowded into the small empty houses in our section of the camp. In the morning, we were herded out to a field and lined up for roll call. There must have been thousands there that first morning, and thousands more arriving during the day. Having counted once, a process which took half the day, the soldiers on horseback started all over again. Other prisoners arrived, confused the count, and again we were numbered. The day was almost over before they were satisfied, and we could be at rest. Days passed with no sign of food. We were counted and counted again. "You will be fed when you are organized," said the officer in charge. But how could they organize people who were dying or dead? Again we were confronted by the open latrines from which the flies flew in swarms. The barns had quickly been stripped of grain and the trees of leaves by the hungry prisoners, so that in 1 week the village looked as though locusts had devoured all the greenery. Of course, dysentery followed, and many who managed to drag themselves to 6 o'clock roll call were themselves dragged lifeless from the field before sundown. One day a terrible scream echoed from the nauseous trench. No guard made a move to investigate, and by the time a group of prisoners themselves had gathered at the brink in helpless consternation, the cries had ceased. Who it was I never learned, nor for all we knew was the body ever removed. There was a rumor in the camp. We were apparently organized at last and would be fed. Women were singled out to help prepare potatoes in the big wheeled tubs, and soon the smell of their cooking became maddening. Gladly we would have downed the raw potatoes if only they'd been thrown to us, but we must wait for the soup to cook. But now a stunning announcement was made. We must bring our container and line up. No container, no soup. A desperate search began. Tin cans were retrieved from ancient trash heaps. Cleaning buckets or feed cans from barns, even chamber pots, were pounced upon. Some unlucky ones prevailed on others to share, and I saw one group of men stand ready with a small feed trough. As for myself, I clutched my find, a tin can which I discovered half buried in the rubble behind a barn, and which I shared with two others. As more people arrived and every building was taken over, some of us moved out to the barns. How I reveled in the bit of straw I called mine. Now I had that, plus a tin can. It seemed a wealth of possessions. It was warmer out there at night, too. Best of all, we felt we had some sense of privacy. The roll calls took only half a day now, and we could move freely outside during most of the afternoon. When it rained, however, even this small pleasure was turned to misery, and we wallowed in an ocean of mud. With the daily influx of new prisoners, the houses and stables became inadequate, and many knew the added misery of being forced to spend the night outside on the wet ground. One day, tin bowls containing about 2 quarts of water each were set out. Incredulous, I watched. Were we actually going to be able to wash? We always took advantage of a summer shower to rub at some encrusted patch of skin, but now placed in front of us were these gleaming pans of water. We applied the luxurious liquid to those parts which seemed most in need, and then gave up our place to the next in line. From eating leaves from the trees to soup drunk from scavenged cans to bathing seemed progress indeed, and we began again to hope that liberation and home were just around the corner. One morning I was called to an empty house where the Russian medic handed me an inkwell, a pen, and paper. Columns were to be drawn for name, age, well, and ill. Good, I thought. Some proper care at last. Of course, it had been difficult to administer the needs of so many people, but now the typhoid and dysentery cases would receive treatment. If only the latrines got some attention. Should I mention it? I put the finishing touches on a large chart. "Send them in," the medic yelled from the other side of the table. In streamed about 50 men, all naked. Shocked, I looked back down at my paper. It was VD inspection, and I was to explain to the men how to present themselves. When in my confusion and embarrassment I indicated that I had no notion what I must say, the medic became furious and explained it all to me in the most indelicate way possible. This I attempted to translate into more sensitive terms to the wretched men. What purpose all this served, I don't know, since no treatment was given anyway. But the emaciated men continued to file by my table, 50 at a time, until I left in July, and still we weren't finished. 2,000 names were called out one morning, Grandma Fuchs, Hilda, Ulrike, and I among them. Though I had escaped the terrible dysentery and typhoid, in fact never suffered from either of these diseases during the years of my imprisonment, I, like everyone, was extremely weak. For some, the hope of going home had supplied that last reserve of strength needed to endure their daily roll calls. I wished so fervently to be released, but having bypassed my home, I realized that every mile east brought me closer to the dreaded limbo of the Russian camps. Here at least I had my bit of straw, my tin can. It was a ludicrous figure I must have cut as I stood that last time on the dusty field for roll call. The miniskirt and coarse farm blouse had long since been replaced by a new issue of clothing collected somewhere along the way. Now I was dressed in a ridiculous black georgette dress. Its yellow stripes were woven of a more durable fabric, and already the filmy material between was disintegrating, leaving hanging tatters of yellow flapping about my knees. Again I had shoes, but the feet within had sturdy calluses now. Already, as we walked out the gate and into the flat farm country, some staggered and fell. We who were able linked arms to drag along as many as possible, for whoever fell was beaten to death. Resolutely planting one foot in front of another walked Grandma Fuchs, dreaming as usual of times and places far removed from the present harsh reality. Near me, a middle-aged man was in trouble. I could hear the agonized gasps for air, and when I looked over in his direction, I could see death written in his gray face. He was looking in my direction as if he knew me, lifting a trembling hand in summons. Sure that this was someone I should know, I moved over to fall into step beside him. He seemed relieved and desperately eager to tell me something. "You know me?" he gasped. His eyes pled for recognition. "No, I'm sorry. Perhaps if you tell me, are you from Berlin? What's your name?" I tucked a hand under his arm and propelled him along as best I could. "Müller, the drugstore, near you." He named a street in the same area of Berlin where I'd lived. I recognized it immediately, but not him. "Yes, Herr Müller, I'm sorry to find you here and that you're ill. Let me help you." Though I didn't know him personally, he seemed immensely relieved to think that I did. "I can't make it. Tell my family, please." "A little more effort. I'll help you." I tried to encourage him, but his stumbling body was already taxing my limited strength. "Promise," he gasped, and fell. Quickly, I dropped to my knees beside him. Others stumbled against us. Then the moving mass parted, leaving behind another bit of rag-clothed flesh upon the country road. He still lived. I meant to whisper some word of comfort in his ear, but one of the guards was upon us, and I managed to fling myself aside just as the rifle crashed down. "Stop!" I shrieked. "He has a family. What has he done?" Again the rifle came down, but now there was no reaction from the inert form on the ground. Herr Müller was dead, and I must remember to carry the news of how and where he died to the pretty little wife who used to sell me pink candies from the tall glass jar on the drugstore counter.